This week we're looking at the unsolved murder or accidental death of a British tourist in Kenya. This is the case of Julianne Ward and the Maasai Mara. Hello everyone, welcome to What in the World, where we talk about anything and everything that makes you think, what in the world? Let's get into it. 20 April 1960. Julianne Ward was born on the 20th of April 1960 in Suffolk, England in the United Kingdom. She was born to parents John and Jan Ward. Julie, for all intents and purposes, had a normal and average childhood. She grew up to have a love for nature, animals, traveling, and photography. 1980 to 1988. When Julie was about 20 years old and had completed her secondary school, she started working as a publishing assistant at Roland Photo Typesetting Limited, a company that offers services in commercial printing and the lithographic process. She worked also as an amateur wildlife photographer for the next 8 years. 7 February 1988. At the beginning of 1988, Julie decided to take a year off work to go on safari in Africa. She decided to join some travel enthusiasts and friends on an overland trip from her home in Suffolk in England, UK, all across Africa, where they would conclude their journey in Kenya. This trip would take a whopping 7 months in total, as they would have numerous stops to camp out and explore their surroundings. Julie and her group set out for Africa on the 7th of February 1988. 27 June 1988. For all intents and purposes, the trip went well for Julie for the first 4 months. On 7 June 1988, she and her group arrived safely in Nairobi, Kenya, in East Africa. 2 September 1988. After enjoying exploring more of Africa and living in Kenya and the surrounding areas for the next 3 months, Julianne Ward decided to visit the Maasai Mara Game and Nature Reserve for about 2 days before heading home to the UK. The Maasai Mara is located about 270 kilometers or 167 miles northwest from Kenya's capital city, Nairobi. Overland, the journey from Nairobi to the Mara takes just over 5 hours, but the road there is so treacherous that many people choose to fly between the two locations. Her and an Australian friend of hers named Dr. Glenn Burns traveled to the Maasai Mara on the 2nd of September, and they planned to return on the 4th. 3 September 1988. The two traveled by road and arrived in the Maasai Mara, where they pitched their tents to camp and explore. However, on the 3rd of September, whilst the two companions were on a game drive, Julie's Jeep broke down. They took a look at the vehicle and discovered that it needed a new fuel pump. 4 September 1988. So the next day, Dr. Glenn Burns flew back to Nairobi with a faulty pump without Julie, who stayed behind to look after the Jeep and their belongings. He promised to send back a new fuel pump for the Jeep. 5 September 1988. And indeed, the next day, a new fuel pump was flown to and arrived in the Maasai Mara for Julie's Jeep. 6 September 1988. On the day after that, on 6 September, the Jeep was fixed and Julie was able to drive it to a camp within the Maasai Mara called the Sand River Camp to collect her and Dr. Glenn Burns' tents and belongings which they had left behind. At the camp, she saw and chatted with a Constable Gerald Karori at around 2:30 p.m. Constable Gerald Karori was the very last person to ever see Julianne Ward alive. 6 to 10 September 1988. For the next 4 days, Julianne's whereabouts were and still are unknown. No alarm bells had yet been sounded. 10 September 1988. But then, on the 10th of September, the friends that Julie had been staying with back in Nairobi, who had been trying to contact her, became increasingly worried at Julie's silence. She was supposed to have been back by the 4th initially, and even with car problems, she would have communicated. Thus, they reported her missing and also informed her parents back in England. 12 September 1988. By the 12th of September, John Ward, Julie's father, had flown to Kenya. it being his first time in Africa, to spear the search for his daughter. 13 September 1988. Kenyan police authorities were not as proactive as John would have liked. So the very next day after he arrived, John organized a search of the Maasai Mara game reserve with volunteers. He also hired several helicopters to do an aerial search of the Mara, particularly all the spots Julie had camped in. Same day, 10:30 a.m. By 10:30 a.m. that very day, the helicopter search team spotted Julie's jeep stuck in a gully in the Maasai Mara next to a river. John personally went to investigate, but there was still no sign of Julie. Same day, 4 p.m. By 4 p.m., the search team had found Julie Ann Ward. Simon Ole Makala, chief warden at the park, was the one to find the exact location that Julie was in, or rather, her partly burnt remains. They found her jawbone, which was split in two, her left leg, and a lock of her hair. It was only a month later when they found her skull. Her father, in fact, was simply handed her skull in a plastic bag whilst he was in his hotel room. So, what happened to Julie Ann Ward? Well, everyone has theories, but no one knows for sure. What is certain is that both the Kenyan government and the British government were initially not very helpful, and for their own individual or joint reasons, have not always supported Julie's family in seeking the truth. You can read more about this in scholar Grace A. Musila's book, Death Retold in Truth and Rumor, which is linked in the description box below. Theory 1. The first and immediate theory put forward by Kenyan officials was that Julie was struck by lightning and then eaten by lions, or that she was first mauled by lions and then struck by lightning. In fact, the Kenyan government's coroner report said that her jaw was split in two as a result of it being gnawed on by the powerful jaws of wild animals. Then the fact that her remains were burnt/charred was as a result of being struck by lightning. Theory 2. John Ward obviously was not satisfied with this theory. To him and many other people, it was obvious that Julie had been murdered, and he believed that Kenyan officials were trying to cover the murder up, so as not to deter other tourists from visiting the Mara, or to protect an important person in Kenya. It was revealed that Britain was also trying to sanitize Julie's death, as a former British Secret Intelligence Service agent later admitted to having involvement in covering up the case. An independent Kenyan coroner and a British pathologist found that Julie's jaw had been cut in two by a sharp blade and not gnawed by wild animals. In fact, the pathologist found that Julie had been beheaded by a machete, doused in petrol and set alight. John Ward began using his own resources, along with investigators from the UK, to seek justice for his daughter. Evidence pointed to a murder, but by whom and for what reason? From the get, it was suspected that men who had worked in the game reserve took advantage of the fact that Julie was a young woman traveling alone. It was suspected that these workers sexually assaulted Julie and then killed her and set her alight in an attempt to get rid of the evidence of what they had done. Two rangers, along with the chief warden at the time, who had led John right to Julie's remains, were immediately suspected. Theory 3. John Ward also suspected that his daughter had been killed by Jonathan Moi. Jonathan Moi was the then Kenyan President Daniel Arap Moi's son. This would explain why Kenyan authorities, and even some British authorities, were extremely keen to cover Julie's death up. The theory was that Jonathan Moi and his cronies were in the nature reserve, drinking and enjoying themselves. When they came across Julie, who was alone, Moi then raped her whilst his friends watched. Moi's brother-in-law, Ibrahim Choge, tried to stop him, but Moi's other friends held him back. Moi then instructed his cronies to dispose of Julie, which they did. Choge, who was married to President Daniel Moi's daughter and Jonathan's sister, had quit working for the family soon after Julie's murder. 10 years later, in 1999, after threatening to expose what Moi had done, Choge died in a car accident, which was, according to John Ward and Choge's own father, undoubtedly foul play, an orchestrated murder intended to silence Choge forever. 1992. By 1992, about 4 years after Julie's murders, 2 game rangers who had been working at the time of the murder were identified as suspects, tried and acquitted. 1998. A new set of Kenyan police took over the case, and 10 years from Julie's murder, there had been over 80 leads. However, from the very beginning, John Ward had felt uneasy about the man who led the search team to the exact location of Julie's remains, Simon Ole Makala, who at the time was the chief warden at the reserve. His argument was that, unless he was responsible or involved in Julie's murder, how did he know the exact place where her remains would be after only 2 hours of joining the search party? However, Makala's defense was that he knew where the remains were by the vultures circling her body in the sky. The trial was marred with corruption and blackmailing, according to John Ward, and Makala was ultimately acquitted and released from his 14-month-long prison stint. He was tried again and acquitted again the following year. 2009. By 2009, the case had been closed and reopened several times. However, Julie's family felt hopeful when John Yates, the head of Scotland Yard's anti-terrorism squad, as well as 2 other members of the unit, decided to lead Kenyan police in a fresh investigation, albeit 20-plus years after the murder. They believed that advancements in forensic technology would prove advantageous to solving the case. On the other hand, several key witnesses had since died, and so the investigation in its entirety was compromised. Not too much came out of the investigation. 2018. In 2018, 30 years after Julie's murder, a then 85-year-old John used the media to appeal to authorities to give him the DNA found at the scene of Julie's remains. He has, since 1988, not been able to acquire this DNA evidence. But he believes that this evidence can point to Julie's murder or murderers. 2020. Remember one of John Ward's suspects, Jonathan Moi? Well, Jonathan Moi died in April of 2019. His father, former Kenyan President Daniel Moi, died in February 2020. And after both their deaths, a few witnesses felt safe to come forward to confirm John's theory that it was Jonathan Moi that had murdered Julie. Jonathan Moi had previously denied these allegations and said he was nowhere near the Maasai Mara at the time. But after his death, witnesses placed him at or close to the crime scene. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened to Julie, and to this day, her family has spent over £2 million trying to seek answers and justice. John Ward is now 89 years old. He says that he is in a race against time to find out what happened to his daughter before he dies. What do you think happened to Julianne Ward? Do you think her case will ever be solved, or will it be solved at least before her father dies? Let us know what you think in the comments down below. Also, please like and subscribe. See you next week.